questions as we go in the chat, and we will get to all of those at the end. We'll also be recording today's session, so we will share the recording and the slides with you by tomorrow. So without further ado, our two speakers who we're thrilled to have here today are Pippa Bailey, who leads the climate change and sustainability practice at Ipsos and is also a speaker from COP26, and Duncan Ferguson, who's the director of social intelligence for SIA and Synthesio. So thank you both so much for being here. With that, I will pass it over to Pippa to kick things off.
Thank you very much. So delighted to be here today for this webinar. And what we'd like to do in the next kind of 45 minutes or so is to share with you 4 kind of notable pieces of insight, if you like, with regard to sustainability, which are grounded in large global studies, often covering 30 or more markets, and bringing together our understanding of society, markets, and people when it comes to sustainability. So these are the 4 topics we're going to touch on. The first is avoiding the pitfalls of ESG silos, because often in a business context, we talk about the environment quite separately from social or societal issues and then governance. The second is around the say-do gap. Now, citizens often get criticised for saying they care about the environment or they care about social issues, but their behaviours would suggest otherwise. But is this the whole story? The third point we want to touch on or to share with you is that sustainability is often considered to be a co-benefit and not the benefit. Often commercially, people see sustainability as an opportunity to premiumize products and services. So we want to unpick this a bit as well. And then finally, we want to look at what sustainability means to consumers, because it's a word that's used more and more frequently. And you know, often it can have very different meanings to different people. So we want to look at that as well. And also to illustrate in this presentation how survey you know, is incredibly powerful in allowing us to have this understanding of people and society, but how social intelligence can really supercharge that and provide some granularity in terms of those insights. So without more ado, let's move on to the first point, avoiding the pitfalls of ESG silos. Now, we know when it comes to sustainability that often the conversation is predominantly focused on the environment. And it's hard to ignore if we look just at the weather events that we've experienced during 2022 across the globe. You know, it's hard to ignore the impact of human activity that's having on climate. And 83% of people globally think we're heading for an environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly.
Likewise, in social data, we see a very similar pattern around specific issues to climate emergency here. We can see conversations relating to it in English language, so US, UK, Australia, India. They actually increased about 36% between September 2021 versus 2022 versus the 12 months previously. And indeed, our tracking of social activity relating to climate emergency over the past couple of years underlines how extreme weather events, global awareness days can generate the highest peaks in online conversation. As an example, April 2021 was Earth Day, and also the reveal of President Biden's climate change plan, which collectively generated over 2 million mentions and nearly 14 million interactions. Come August 2021, we saw spikes in conversation relating to Hurricane Ida, the wildfire season on the west coast of the US. And likewise in 2022, we see a lot of conversation from around the world, most notably in the UK, relating to the particular heat waves that we experienced just this summer.
But it's not all about the environment, particularly kind of driven by the COVID pandemic. We've seen a greater increase in social issues as well. If we think just Black Lives Matter, which obviously started in the US with the killing of George Floyd, and then the Me Too movement as well, but also LGBTQ2+. And these things have really actually come to the fore.
Likewise, actually, one nice prism to use is actually search data here. So this is a couple of search data trends using Google Trends, looking at search volumes relating to Black Lives Matter and then also to the Me Too movement. Here I've chosen worldwide, but I could as easily have chosen UK or US as examples. What's been striking is how very rapidly and how enormous these both issues became in social and also search data. But also, even though they trailed off rather quickly, they're still generating large amounts of online conversation. So on Synthesia, we're running at about just over 1 million mentions a month relating to Black Lives Matter, just over 40,000 a month relating to Me Too, as examples. And I suppose the underlying theme from here is the sense that certainly in the data that we see, it's reflecting a society, if you will, that's very sensitized to these issues and very sort of ready to engage and learn and talk about them.
And I think this is important to bear in mind, because when we ask the question, again, this is a global survey, which of the following topics do you worry about most in your country? We see that the day-to-day issues which impact people's lives and their ability to provide for their families and to look after them tend to come first. So we see inflation there, which is an issue in various countries around the world at the moment. Poverty, unemployment, crime, healthcare. These all come above some other issues, particularly you can see here climate change. And this is because those issues, whether they be environmental or social, come to the fore when events occur. But mainly as humans, we worried about the things that impact us in our day-to-day. So we shouldn't forget that these things are really important when we come to environment and social issues that Duncan talked about, but the urgent tends to overtake the important. And also, often, as I said at the start, sustainability is discussed only in terms of the environment. But this question looks at when we ask people around the world the role of multinational companies and the responsibility that they have. And we were asked them to choose between environmental, societal, and governance issues. We actually see there's a fairly equal split between the importance of these different topics. So we need to be very careful not just to focus on the environment or the social issues, but to be considering all of them, because for most consumers and customers, it's about businesses and organizations behaving well, rather than necessarily a focus on the different sections of that behaving well that we look at. And I think it's also important that actually citizens across the globe have already made the link between the E of environment and the S of social, that our ability to do well and thrive as a species on this planet is heavily related to our use or abuse of the planet, to the environment in which we live. And this is a really interesting figure, that 62%, so almost 2/3 of global citizens, believe that the COVID pandemic, which is still around us, we're not through it totally, is linked to our misuse of the environment. And actually, a kind of suggestion here that the environment is almost fighting back to redress the balance that perhaps we have created. And there is some scientific link to this, so it's not just a thought, but it's possibly embedded in some reality. So that's our first point, that we want to make sure that we avoid the ESG silos when we're thinking about customers and consumers. They don't think in these silos, they think in terms of organisations and businesses behaving well. The second point we wanted to come to was the say-do gap, or at Ipsos and Synthesia, what we talk about is the believe-true gap. The fact that it's not just to do with the fact that people say they care about environmental and social issues and they're not acting, but there's something more complicated going on which the data is revealing to us. So when we ask people who should be taking action, and this is specifically to do with climate change, we see that when we ask people, you see in the turquoise bar, that's needs to act, and the blue bar is who they think is acting, you see the biggest gaps are for government and also for private companies. So there's an expectation or a belief that government and organisations are not doing it there enough. when we look at citizens and consumers themselves, we actually see that they already think they are doing enough, that their need to act matches their actions that they're taking. If we dig a bit deeper and we look at the things that people are doing themselves, their own contribution to climate change, we see that they're unlikely to make the changes that will have the biggest impact. So they're predominantly doing things like avoiding products which have a lot of packaging, or buying too many new goods, or saving water or energy at home. And this is despite the fact that we know, again, this is a global figure, that 7 in 10 say that they know what actions to take to tackle climate change. But the question here is, do they really? So this question asked, which of the following, if any, do you think would have most impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And what we see here is that the top choice, almost half of global citizens are choosing recycling. Following this, we see things like switching to purchasing renewable energy, buying more durable items, shifted public transport, and so on. So here we have a rank order of the things that people think will have the biggest impact in reducing their own footprint in terms of greenhouse gases. Now, there are 13 options here, but actually we looked at scientific data that looked at the carbon footprint of different actions, 60 different actions. And here we can see the actual true rank of those actions. And interestingly, the bottom impact is recycling, whereas this was the top choice chosen by citizens. And when you look at that relative order compared to the true rank, we can see that there's not a strong relationship between what people think will have an impact and what will actually have an impact. And they tend to overestimate the actions that they are taking themselves and underestimate the bigger actions that they could take. For example, living car-free, having a vegan diet, or renovating their house for efficiency. So we like to think that, rather than people saying they care and they're not acting, it's more to do with a lack of understanding, a need for greater education. And businesses and organisations have a responsibility to help educate citizens, because small actions by individuals multiplied up can have very significant steps.
So Pippa there just talked about the complexity of these issues and the need for education for consumers in order to make better decisions to more accurately fulfill what they consider to be the right things to happen. This is just a small and seemingly irreverent example, again from Google Trends, lining up, in this case, search volumes for Taylor Swift versus Greta Thunberg over the past year. We could have easily put in Beyonce or any other celebrities or pop stars one can think of, and you'll get a very similar pattern. This is not to downplay the role that Greta Thunberg has played in shifting debate and so forth. But it's just to underline, if you will, that as well as the complexities that consumers need to navigate, even when they're concentrating on aspects of ESG, there's still that elephant in the room, if you will, of the competition for headspace overall and what other priorities consumers may have. So although it's a very much an irreverent example, nonetheless it illustrates and hopefully sets us up for the next section, which will be talking about the role, if you will, when we focus much more around brands and on organizations and the types of things that we should be expecting and challenging ourselves to do. Our starting point is that we need a closer listening and observation of consumers. We'll see that consumers generally expect sustainability to be a co-benefit rather than the benefit, for all the many reasons that Pippa's illustrated. But we'll unpack this and prove this over the next few slides. It is important nonetheless that thinking about the term #sustainability, that this is something that's growing in importance. So it's doubled in online conversation over the past year or so, from the levels of 80,000 or so up to where we're seeing 160, 180,000 mentions per month in social data. I'll unpack in due course, in the spirit of understanding people, markets and society, what #sustainability, what consumers are associating with sustainability. But for the moment, it's important to know that the tide really is going in the direction of sustainability, and it's more important than ever to consider it in any one strategy.
So when we think about sustainability, as Duncan's just illustrated there, it is rising in terms of the discussions and also the awareness in the minds of consumers and customers. And when we're thinking about innovation, whether that be products or services, the same rules apply. People still expect the product to be highly relevant to them and also highly differentiated. And if it's both of these things, then it's going to have a much stronger trial in year one than those that only meet one or other of the criteria. And as we said, sustainability products are no different. People still expect that they will have the same functional and emotional benefits that they expect with their current product. And we want to illustrate this a little bit through willingness to pay, which tends to be a huge topic, something that we get asked about a lot. How willing are people to pay for sustainability? And I want to share with you a study that was conducted on our SimStore digital platform, which mimics, if you like, a proper online store, so people can search and buy products and put them in their virtual basket. And in this study, we created a hypothetical product. It's a dishwasher product at Sustain, and this was conducted in the United States with hundreds of participants. And so people were allowed to shop as they normally would for a dishwasher liquid. And this Sustain product we presented in different cells, so totally different groups of consumers. We changed the product in either with a claim about sustainability in terms of ocean-bound plastics being used in the packaging, or no claim at all. And we also presented other cells with different price points to see how that affected the ability to put in baskets. So this is not to do with asking people propensity to buy, but it's more capturing actual purchase behavior in a simulated style. So what we see is that when we have the product available with a sustainability claim, we see a significant uplift in the proportion of people, there's obviously hundreds of people, who are putting it in their basket. So sustainability definitely has a significant uplift. We then looked at that same product with different cells of consumers at two different price points, $475 and $525. And what we saw is that when we increased the price just a little bit, we saw that significant difference in choice behavior was actually reduced. So it was no longer significant when we tested it. And when we actually accounted for the cost in terms of using ocean-bound plastics in the packaging and sold the product at $5.25, we saw that there was no benefit at all, that they were then at parity, whether it had a claim or no claim. So actually then you lose any advantage. And this is where we see that, most citizens, most consumers and customers expect sustainability to be delivered as the pro-benefit rather than the benefit. However, it's never as simple as this, because our customers and consumers are not a homogeneous mass of people, but they're people with different levels of concern and different levels of activity and engagement in sustainability related topics. Now, we don't have the time during the course of this webinar to go through this sustainability segmentation in detail, but please do ask if you'd like access to the paper, which provides more detail on it, and hope will be of use and of interest. But we do see these different groups. So we have 17% of global citizens. This was conducted across 15 markets, who are activists. These tend to be younger people who are very engaged and want to drive and see significant change. But they perhaps don't have the spending power to be able to pay for sustainability in premium products. We then have pragmatists, who 29%. These people tend to be slightly older and slightly more affluent as well. So this segment does have an ability and a willingness to pay some premium towards sustainable products. And then we see some complexity with regard to conflicted contributors, who at a very top line level, we would say, struggle to pay. And then busy bystanders who are engaged, they are active, but they need to have products which are very frictionless and don't disrupt their existing life. But I don't have time to go into this in more detail, but it's important to remember that we're not targeting a kind of homogenous mass of people, and that there are differences and different hooks and levers to engage people with sustainable products. But what we can conclude from this and from subsequent research that we've done is that all things being equal, sustainability will be the preferred choice. So sometimes, you know, it's thought about in terms of premiumization and a commercial opportunity, but it's more like to be a commercial threat of not looking at sustainability and what a brand or a service can do in terms of looking at their impact and how they can focus on aligning that with the brand, with the offering, to provide a more sustainable solution.
Thanks, Pippa. So in this final section, I really want to understand much more about what sustainability means to consumers. So far, we've unpacked the role of sustainability in wider consumer thinking. We've underlined how important sustainability is to people, but that not necessarily it'll be the #1 thing they think about all the time. And we've also observed, both from Pippa's most recent comment and from the slide I showed earlier, the conversation and engagement with sustainability is increasing more and more. So that's fantastic. But what do I do? What do I say? What do I show? How do I innovate? Well, this is really where, for example, social data really comes into its own. Social data is just a fantastic tool here because it enables us to essentially take a fresh look, apply fresh listening to organic conversations that consumers are having relating to sustainability. And from that, we can observe what matters to them and therefore unpack it and decide where we want to play. So this is a real analysis that we ran with Synthesio, using Synthesio just a couple of months ago. We wrote a query, just as I illustrated a moment ago, where the query to draw in the data is literally the term #sustainability. The value of that data set is essentially we're letting consumers tell us what they're associating with sustainability via that hashtag. So rather than writing ornate queries trying to second guess all the different aspects that might or might not be relevant, we can discover bottom up how consumers are talking about, and most importantly, what consumers are talking about. And from that, we yield, give or take, a long list of, I think we started with over 100 or so topics that the in-tool topic model within Synthesio generated. And as analysts, we could then curate, name, and cluster those topics to describe the key themes as observing. Almost by design, this is looking at something like quite a complex patchwork to navigate. And I think that's part of the point, is that there is no one single sustainability here. There are multiple different themes that consumers are attaching to the term #sustainability. This data is actually just from 3 months that we picked in the middle of the year, and you'll see points around plastic-free July and so forth. And that's underlining that also this data is varied over time as events come and go, be they either as the popular events, plastic-free July, and or actual society or environmental events, as we saw the impact of earlier on. And that underlines the importance to monitor and engage with this topic over time and not assume that whatever you have today is something that will eternally become true. But from this diversity of conversation, you can see conversation relating to water, climate change, sustainability in business, ESG, all the different things that Pippa was alluding to, that it isn't just one thing, it's not even just the environment, but it captures the role of different organizations, different economic activities, different actors in the sustainability conversation. The second thing, as a marketer, as a brand, as a communicator, is that net sentiment relating to the #sustainability is overwhelmingly positive. All of the areas we see not net positive sentiment. It becomes lowest for aspects around plastic, as example, and I think packaging, it almost gets to the point of being neutral. But generally, sustainability is a good territory to claim. And of course, that's evidenced by the work Pippa showed a moment ago about the propensity to pay a premium for sustainable product that claims sustainability. So we can understand the diversity of conversation here, and we can understand that overall we can look individually through Synthesio's capabilities at the sentiment attached to them. But then we can think much more strategically about, as an organization, a brand, a communicator, how I should interpret them and how I might be able to use each of those domains to achieve the objectives that I have. So we developed this sort of custom typology that qualitatively, by immersing in the data, we could then plot the different conversation domains against. I think the first axis we observed is when some of the domains were more about solutions and others were more about issues or problems. On the horizontal axis, some of them are big macro themes, and others seem much more micro and almost sort of niche, and sort of almost a surprise to see them bubbling up. But of course, that's the point. But then we can plot them out one by one. So if we take the, for example, the top left-hand quadrant, so these are the big macro themes that are good global significance, if you will, but also typically part of the solution to things like reforestation, solar power, electric vehicles, for example. Then on the top right-hand quadrant, we'll see probably that the more niche areas that are still very much, when we read into the data, they're actually more about the solution as well. Sport, as an example, there's a lot of conversation relating to professional sporting bodies, teams, for example, and the different activities that they're taking to increase the sustainability of their activities. Growing your own food, recipes to improve, to have a lighter footprint on the world. Tourism, as an example, a lot of conversation relating to toiletries and beauty products. On the bottom left, I think it would be, we see the macro issues, which tend to be more on the issue domain. So when people talk about climate change, it's typically an issue. Oceans, it's more of an issue. Air pollution, likewise, aviation also was typically described more as an issue. And then the bottom right, the micro issues, these are things like food waste, paper printing, and so forth. Again, it's a qualitative judgment, but it's getting us, it makes it useful when we drill into the data to understand the role and the presence of the different topics of conversation. But I suppose this can then, this type of simple typology can then be quite a handy springboard to go a bit further. So we can click through in Synthesio and look at the types of accounts that are publishing and originating the content. What we find is typically many of the conversations on the macro end of the scale were often a lot of comments that where consumers are, people are reacting to and discussing stories that may have been disseminated through, for example, broadcast or mainstream media. On the right-hand micro area, those are conversations, when we drill into them, they tend to be originating either directly from the consumers themselves and or from niche brands, niche pressure groups that are very specific to the aspect of interest. Now, we found this quite interesting because if you can navigate the importance of them and the role they play, the voices that are driving them, that automatically starts giving us some helpful implications as to how to consider them as going forward. So the macro themes, ultimately these are big themes that are, if you will, part of the culture. And therefore they're very influential for consumers in shaping expectations. And if you will, you can see the cultural context within which any message or any product would need to land. The micro area tends to be incredibly insightful in terms of getting a sense of, for example, what are the consumer ideas? What are the consumer motivations? Where are consumers frustrated? What are consumers doing about it? What are the workarounds? What are the hacks that consumers might be applying to get to where they want? And so we thought we'd just drill into this a little bit further by just taking one of the domains, actually. So we looked at coffee production, which bubbled up in the data as being something of interest. It's an area conversation in the top right-hand bubble that's nearly doubled over the past year or so, and net sentiment is overwhelmingly positive. So coffee in the context of sustainability conversations is overwhelmingly a positive thing. And so what we could do is start drilling into the data more qualitatively and see what's going on in the conversation. I think the first thing to underline is there are almost sort of two conversations almost happening in parallel, in underlying a very diverse set of topics that people talk about relating to coffee. We observe generally the brands, sustainability conscious organizations, local cafes, independent cafes, for example, are often talking about conversations around the coffee production and the ethics of the supply chain. Consumers, meanwhile, are really focusing about talking about their reducing their personal waste, for example, disposable coffee cups, pods for home machines, and so forth. We can unpack that a bit more in the next build when we look at, for example, the needs and motivations. More qualitatively, we can interpret what's going on here. We can observe a real sense of pride among a lot of consumers, of showcasing the choices that they're making, showcasing the hacks that they're applying and the benefits that they're getting from it. There's also a sense of almost independence here. The consumer conversation isn't suggesting people are trying to follow something. They're very much proud of the decisions that they independently are coming to. On the brand and cafe side, we see a real drive for, if you will, ultimately it's about authenticity and underlining their ESG credentials of their coffee and their underlying brand. We can then drill into this still further by, for example, drilling into the consumer language and the types of things consumers are doing. So when consumers are showcasing activities, what are they doing? Well, for example, there are couple of examples, but mainly focused around the creative recycling of old coffee grinds. We could have picked many different examples here. We've just picked this one to illustrate the wealth of underlying social data. So as an example, a lot of conversation from consumers talking about how they're reusing coffee grinds to, for example, fertilize their houseplants or put out for their trees or hedges in the garden. There's also quite a lot of conversation around using coffee grounds as a body scrub, as a facial or skin scrub, and the many benefits that the consumer gets from that. I particularly like this quote here because it's not just showcasing the benefits of the coffee grinds as a facial scrub. It's also linking it to the organic nature of the coffee in the first place, and that user is wanting to avoid putting anything with pesticides on their face, and it just underlines the decision making and the kind of the independence of thought that consumer is showing. The final thing that social data can do, of course, is it can tell us through the AI what are the brands, what are the entities that are emerging that could be part of the future. And again, as an innovator, as a communicator, as a brand, these can be very exciting to get hold of early sight of and observe what they're doing, how they're talking about what they're doing, and maybe use that to help ideate or drive innovation decisions against. This is one from many different examples that we could have picked. And it's a brand called Grind. It's a London-based coffee company producing home compostable coffee pods for some Nespresso machines. And the idea is that both that the coffee is ethically sourced and organic, and it's available through subscription, and the pods themselves are compostable, which gives the consumers the peace of mind, if you will, of the end-to-end benefits that this service is providing. So just in sort of 3 or 4 minutes, hopefully I've given you something of a view of how you can go from something super macro of bringing in a query just relating to hashtag sustainability, use the AI to bring the data apart, tell us all the distinct domains, and then be able to drill into any one domain at will and observe the consumer stories, consumer rationale behind it, and get some very tangible inspiration for communication and innovation going forward. And I suppose I wanted to use that just to help us close out this webinar with 3 observations. and really just underlining the role that different data sources can bring in helping navigate what is necessarily a very complex and fiendishly challenging domain to navigate. The first insight we have is that survey tells us just how important aspects of sustainability are to consumers. But as we see, they're not necessarily top of mind or the most urgent issues that consumers are facing in their day-to-day lives. Social data can tell us what it looks like. It can tell us, for example, the peaks in activity around specific issues, and also the role that sustainability has within wider consumer thinking. The second point is through survey, we could discover ultimately that consumers aren't always the best witnesses to know what best to do. And there's lots of false attribution, there's lots of confusion. And of course, there's a lot of education that needs to happen for consumers to make the choices that perhaps they really wish to make. From the social side, it can really help us unpack, if you will, what's the lived environment, what's the data domain that consumers are navigating, the many distractions, sources of conflicting information that a consumer might have to face. And the final point is, I suppose, in a much more positive and actionable way, is a survey just underlines how important it is that sustainability is something of a co-benefit, therefore, rather than the benefit from any given product or service. And social can tell us what to do about it. It unpacks sustainability, the many different associations that hashtag sustainability might carry, what the insights are that powering them, for example, the hacks or consumer workarounds that consumers are showing us they're doing to try to get to the objectives that they have, as well as the language, imagery, and indeed the channels that will help us shape the desirable big stories to drive the conversation. So with that, over 40 minutes or so, I think that concludes our observation. So I think back to you, Emma.
Awesome, thank you so much. We have quite a few questions, so I will just kick us off with the first one. I think maybe it's probably for Pippa, but are there major differences in all of the findings, specifically for Western Europe compared to other parts of the world?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of complexity in there. It depends what topic we're talking about, but obviously concern, if we're thinking about the environment to start with, concern in the global south is obviously much higher than the global north because that's where they're seeing the greatest impact of climate change. We have some data coming out very shortly. Sorry that this is a teaser rather than the insight. But what we've done is we've looked, similar to Duncan, but using survey, what hashtag sustainability means using the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And it is very different actually across the globe. So hopefully we can share that, but it is very interesting. And also what different countries expect that they would like their leaders to focus on. So we see a different balance of environmental and social issues, as you can imagine, because the political, economic, social, etc. condition is very different in the different markets. So yes, we do see differences. And I'm also asked a lot about kind of generations as well, because people say, oh, don't young people care more? And we, again, are going to be investigating this much more in the new year. But what we do see, particularly in that segmentation I shared, was that young people are actually, there's a bit of polarization, that there's a group of young people who are very activist and kind of not necessarily making the small changes, but demanding action. But there's also quite a few younger people who are also a bit fatalistic, think that it's too late. But yes, definitely, we see big differences across the globe, and I'm happy to pick up individually later if there's specific areas that people are interested in. So it is, you know, we're often presenting global figures, but there's a lot of complexity.
Perfect. Okay, next question for Duncan. I like your approach of using a simple hashtag query like hashtag sustainability instead of using a complex Boolean query. Is this a typical approach you take when trying to see what people are saying about a given topic or theme?
Yeah, I think more and more, I mean, to be truthful, that the game changer has just been the ability, for example, to use the Intel topic modeling that enables us very quickly to get a sense of what could be a very big and complex domain. And so it's changed the way that we're often generating insights and approaching issues. And probably had you asked me 3 years ago, then maybe this approach might not have been the best one, because I think we wouldn't have been able to get with the speed to the types of insights that we're bringing you today. But more and more, we're finding this approach works well, where we bring in a very diverse data set, and then we use the AI basically to help us filter out the things that we know to be irrelevant, completely irrelevant, and then help us make sense of everything that's left. I shouldn't downplay, though, that there is a real role for the analyst here. So the 34 topics that we came to, they don't come out straight away. It takes a lot of immersion and in the data to curate and cluster things appropriately. But we find that we've applied similar approaches, for example, to people help understand conversation about people managing their own money. So just a query relating to my money. And then we've also been working, for example, around aspects such as conversations around people's employment and what it's like to be in the world of work at the moment. So very simple queries about my job, my company, my boss, my employer are bringing in a ton then of employment related conversation that we can then use the AI to pull apart and explain for us. So over time, the speed and agility now of the in-tool topic modeling enables us to access and interrogate very general domains much more easily than before, and get to the types of insights that we bring you today.
I was also going to, if I can just add to that, Duncan, because often we use it in terms of, survey provides kind of some of the big pointers, and then the search and social provides the kind of depth of insight and understanding. But actually, using the hashtag sustainability, it's too easy for us sometimes when we're designing surveys to assume what we think is important or what people will consider. But it's really useful to use social in this way, where we've used hashtag sustainability to say, well, if we want to ask a quant survey to understand the importance or the issues that people concern people, for example, to use that understanding of hashtag sustainability to even understand what's in people's minds to help us direct how we structure the responses, so that they actually come from the consumer voice rather than the assumptions that we might make about what should be in that survey response. So it can work very, very well both ways to make sure that we're getting the best insight we can.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, another one for you. Is carbon footprint embedded in climate change? Any detail on how people are thinking about carbon emissions?
Yeah, I think generally people are not thinking that much about carbon emissions, but there is a reasonable level of understanding that our actions, particularly use of fossil fuels, use of diesel and petrol cars, contributes to climate change. So there's that level of understanding. But I think that, when we talked about the belief tree gap, there's a huge need for everyone to be more carbon literate. And we did some research this year looking at school leavers and their understanding of climate change. And that kind of reinforced the need for better education, because we are driven very much by finances, and we can easily look at two products and say, well, I think that one would be about £2.50 if you're in the UK, and that one's perhaps £6. It looks like it would be twice as expensive. We're very good at being able to look at products and services and kind of guesstimate how much. But in terms of choices with regard to carbon footprint, we have very poor understanding of the choices that we make for most things. And I think as time goes on, there will be a need for us to all be more carbon literate when making choices. And there are brands that are, I can think of Oatly, who actually have started putting the carbon footprint and making comparisons to their competitors. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. But I think there is a need for understanding, because I think when we have that transparency of understanding about the carbon footprint of different products or services, we can start making more informed choices too.
Okay, I will go with 2 more questions, and then any of the questions that we don't get to, I see they're still coming in, we will take offline and get back to you. But a twofold question for you, Duncan. First part is, did you apply the topic modeling's automated queries, or did you simply identify the big themes? And the second part of that is it possible to run this kind of social analysis for different countries or different languages?
I think so. Yes, it was exactly a bottom-up analysis. So we didn't, once we had the corpus of data relating to hashtag sustainability, that was what we ran the topic model on. And it's actually quite interesting here on the previous question relating to carbon footprint. It was interesting, actually, carbon footprint didn't come up as a topic, but I'm pretty confident in the wealth of data that it would be very present in multiple topics. And then that would talk to, for example, the role of doing, for example, a top-down query, where we could look for all the different areas within which carbon footprint is connected. Likely there's a topic around climate change, one couple around EVs, for example, tourism. The second question, can we do this for across different languages? Absolutely. And this is, I think, when Pippa was mentioning the differences by market and by geography in some of the survey questions. Social also enables us to do this, as I expect the composition of conversation relating to sustainability will necessarily change over time. We know that because of the time series, and there'll be different things coming in and out. Likewise, over different countries, that will change as well. And I think that the insights that one can learn about what sustainability means or is associated with in people in different languages, different cultures, countries, can be absolutely vital to anybody either looking to work in one or operate in one market and or seeking for a single global narrative that would somehow transcend the world. So expect it to be different by market and by language, and I think that's part of the, if you will, that's part of the value of social data, is the speed with which you can discover that.
Awesome. Okay, last one, and then again, like I said, we'll follow up individually with some of the rest of the questions that have been asked. But I will end on this one for you, Pippa. What are your thoughts on COP27? Any important themes or takeaways that you can share with us?
Okay, so that's a big topic. I think generally the overall sentiment from COP27 is it was a little bit disappointing, and the reason that I say that is the kind of lack of firmer commitments to keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise since pre-industrial times alive. So there was still that wish, but there was no reinforcement of the commitment from countries to do that, and that was, I think, the biggest disappointment, because we really need to have that commitment to make sure that we're on track to do it. That said, you know, there were positive movements in other areas. There was less focus on the kind of big targets, big goals, but lots of focus on kind of investment in new tech and solutions which can be scaled very quickly. So kind of looking to science and technology as the route to get us out of this and to be able to address the challenges that we face with regard to climate change. So that was positive because it was very practical discussions at COP, I would say. There was also kind of good progress made on climate finance. So there's a kind of, Glasgow had a kind of financial alliance for net zero. There's 100 more member countries now than there was a year ago. So that's really good. And that kind of alliance is bringing together a framework for transition planning, setting out how it will happen. So, you know, that is very positive in itself. There was quite a lot of discussion about fossil fuels to clean energy and the need to do this, and obviously political and economic situation has kind of driven that conversation further, if you like, the kind of need for sort of energy security, both globally and nationally. So that's definitely got a lot of attention at this COP. Also putting price on carbon emissions, so carbon trading. I haven't got time to go into detail, but that's a kind of positive thing, because if we can measure, then we can put cost against it and prices against the carbon, and carbon trading and trying to manage better that. And then the biggest, I suppose, positive story was compensation in terms of loss and damage caused by climate change, by the creation of a new fund to help compensate emerging and developing economies. So that was because, as I alluded to earlier, those countries that are impacted most, that are suffering most as a result of climate change, are those that have the least or the lowest carbon footprint, or they've had the least contribution towards climate change. So it's really important that the countries that have had an impact are supporting the funds towards putting those things right. And then finally, The other big positive thing was kind of putting a bit of a value on nature, if you like, in terms of actually nature has a huge role to play in terms of protecting us from climate change as well. So if you just think about the mangrove swamps and these kind of things, so it's actually putting a value on the protection that nature provides. So it's kind of moving the discussion on the value of nature and protecting it, in protecting ourselves. So it was a very much a mixed bag at COP, but disappointment on the fact of the commitments to keeping to the 1.5 degrees, which is the kind of always the headline figure, and the fact that we're essentially going to have to halve our emissions if we get any chance of getting there in the next few years before 2025.
All right, thank you both so much. Thank you for taking some of the heavy hitting questions too. So thanks to everyone who joined today. We will wrap it up here, and again, share the slides and recording with you by tomorrow, and follow up with you if you have an outstanding question we didn't get a chance to get to. So thank you, Pippa. Thank you, Duncan. Thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.